Somewhere across the ocean, in a country controlled by unelected religious dictators, now racked by violence and the efforts of millions of people to make their voices heard, a single person wrote 2 questions on a computer or a smartphone and then hit send. Electrons carried those 2 questions around the world, across the ocean, to the most powerful man in the world. Our 4th story tonight, President Obama gives the world his answer to a question from an unknown, unnamed person facing an uncertain future in Iran, if we are to believe this story. Huffington Post revealing to Countdown tonight some of the less sensitive details about the questioner, a professional male who works in his 30s, who works online. At today's news conference, the president called on Nico Pitney, a reporter for that site, who had written that he was soliciting questions from Iranians for the president. The president said he was aware of this and then asked Pitney for a question. It was not a request for help nor saber-rattling. It was a fairly sophisticated question about the delicate position in which Obama finds himself, wanting to aid Iranians without providing justification for crackdowns, about how he will engage with Iran if Ahmadinejad remains.
Under which conditions would you accept the election of Ahmadinejad? And if you do accept it without any significant changes in the conditions there, isn't that a betrayal of what the demonstrators there are working towards?
Well, look, we didn't have international observers on the ground. We can't say definitively what exactly happened at polling places throughout the country. What we know is that a sizable percentage of the Iranian people themselves, spanning Iranian society, consider this election illegitimate. It's not an isolated instance, little grumbling here or there. There is significant questions about the legitimacy of the election. And so ultimately, the most important thing for the Iranian government to consider is legitimacy in the eyes of its own people, not in the eyes of the United States. And that's why I've been very clear. Ultimately, this is up to the Iranian people to decide who their leadership is going to be and the structure of their government.
With us tonight, Houman Majd, an Iranian-American and author of The Ayatollah Begs to Differ, The Paradox of Modern Iran. Thank you for coming in, sir.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Was the question any good, and was the fact of the question of any good?
I don't think so. I think it was I think Obama gave a very good answer. I think the question is a little bit silly because it's really not up to the United States to decide whether a government is legitimate or not. It's much like asking the French after the 2000 election here, what are you going to do if President Bush becomes the president, before the Supreme Court made him the president. So it's kind of like, you know, it's irrelevant almost. And I think the vast majority of Iranians, certainly the ones I talk to, and that's not obviously the vast majority of Iranians I'm talking to, but the people I talk to on the ground, and I speak at least once or twice a day to Tehran, this is not a question that's in their minds. It's an Iranian issue. They're trying to sort it out themselves. The protesters are out there very bravely. They're being brutalized by their government in some instances. And it's an internal issue. It's not up to it's an arrogant position to take, to say, for America, we're going to agree that you're legitimate or not legitimate. By the way, it's also a silly question because right now, as it stands, the United States doesn't have diplomatic relations with Iran and therefore doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the Iranian government.
So what would have been questions? What are the questions that would be on that, in those protests, on those streets right now, that could be asked and provide some insight from an American leader?
Well, I think that the questions are, for most Iranians who are on the streets right now, that we know who are on the streets, and that obviously the numbers are dwindling as every day that goes by, but for a lot of those people who are still on the streets, or the people who shout Allahu Akbar every night on the rooftops, or even on the streets now, as well as the rooftops at night, where they have some anonymity, for those people it's just for the rest of the world to be aware. It's not so much that they want help. They certainly don't want America to send in the troops. They certainly don't want any interference. For starters, the Iranian government is already very paranoid about this being a velvet revolution being instigated by the CIA, the $75 million that the United States has for regime change. There are CIA agents around Iran, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Are they crossing the border? Are they paying Iranians off? Are there agents inside Iran? There's all these questions, and with a very bad and long history of relations between the United States and Iran, it's certainly not helpful for the United States to add fuel to the fire and allow the Iranian government to make those charges stick with the Iranian people.
The way they tried to make that charge stick are these sort of textbook Orwell stuff, these televised confessions that implicate the broadcasts from the United States.
Right.
Do you have a sense of how that would be reacted to? Would it be is there a way to gauge the percentages of people who would believe this and who would think it's simply farcical and self-supporting by the state?
A lot of people don't believe the state television. Absolutely. They're sophisticated. Iranians are very sophisticated. They don't necessarily, but there will be some people who do. Every piece of evidence that they can provide, and they don't really believe a televised confession, but every other piece of evidence they can provide will be accepted by a portion. We have to remember, as you pointed out, these demonstrations were, as Obama pointed out as well, that these demonstrations were across the socioeconomic scale. Everybody was demonstrating in the initial days after the election. They weren't demonstrating to overthrow the government. They were demonstrating to protest what they thought was a fraudulent vote. It's legitimate, and Mousavi, the opposition candidate, wasn't asking for the government to be overthrown. He was just asking for the vote to be a real vote, and therefore he was asking for a revote. And to get that scale of protest, to get that many people, to get women in chadors, men, bearded men, men who are Western-looking, students, old people, all those people to come out in the streets, if there was any idea, if there was any notion that this was being manipulated by the West, they won't get those people. A lot of those people will start being peeled off.
You said that the numbers are certainly declining. Richard Engel had postulated that this was, and the evidence suggested that this was morphing into some attempt to keep a semi-permanent protest or dissent form viable without getting people killed on the streets. Is that where it's going now?
Well, I think as long as Mousavi keeps up the fight, and he's been silent today, but as long as he is saying that he is not accepting what the Guardian Council is saying, at least, well, they haven't actually made a definitive decision yet, and they've actually extended it now, the period. They were going to tomorrow, Wednesday. They've extended it to Monday, when they're going to give their final decision. Depending on what that final decision is, if that final decision is to certify the election with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad as president, it depends on what Mousavi says. The leader of this movement has to come out one way or another. Either he has to accept it or not. And if he doesn't accept it and continues the protest or continues to ask his supporters to protest peacefully however they can, I think it will continue for a long time, yes. But I think they won't go out on the streets the way they have been going because the government's been very good at dispersing those protests.
Indeed it has. Houman Maj, the author of The Ayatollah Begs to Differ, The Paradox of Modern Iran. Great thanks for your time. Pleasure to meet you, sir.
Thank you very much.